Do I have time to tell the story about the one time I was apprehended by authorities of the law? Yes. Thank you. Summer of '84. My family took the station wagon down to Disney World. We were on a Dumbo ride, so you're all connected to this central sort of revolving thing. And to start each car, to turn it on, there's a button that you have to push. My mother's in the middle, I'm on the left, my older sister is on the right. I was about 4, my older sister was about 6. I said, I want to push the button to start the ride, at which point my older sister promptly slammed the button and turned on our car. I proceeded to go on a profanity-laced tirade that was really unbecoming of a 4-year-old, screaming and crying, at which point the entire ride was shut down and Disney World Rangers escorted me off the ride and delivered me to my father, who was standing stoically as ever with a vacant look in his eyes and a clenched jaw. And that was the only time I've ever been apprehended by authorities of the law, other than the 4 times I was arrested as an undergraduate. Our next speaker, Rachel Aumiller, is a doctoral candidate in philosophy at Villanova University. She specializes in early modern and 19th century German social and political philosophy with a focus on communal affect. Her dissertation on comic anguish explores the role of communal laughter in the works of Hegel and the young Hegelians by looking at both Hegel's and Marx's relationship to ancient comedy. Her work also engages Marxist Hegelians from the, I forgot to ask you to pronounce this one, Ljubljana School, close enough, of psychoanalysis, notably from the works of Mladen Dolar and Alenka Zupančić. I did ask about those 2 names. The title of her paper this evening is Laughing at the Law, Marx on the Censorship of Affect.
Laughter is a powerful force in a community's formation and self-understanding. Laughter can unify a group, implicitly strengthening shared cultural values and senses of pleasure, but it can also divide and destroy. Laughter that expresses ridicule, for example, marks its object as an outsider, suggesting that this other has no place within the community's borders. This presentation explores the theme of communal laughter in the early writings of Karl Marx, who considers the spirit of Greek comedy as a condition for critique. Marx draws specifically on the destructive side of laughter, which he identifies as the critical spirit necessary for revolutionary communal action. The first section of this paper analyzes the ancient Greek attitude toward katagalon, which means the process of laughing something down. Laughter of this nature was considered dangerous because it could incite violence, disrupt the social order, or threaten political authority. Athenian law thus restricted and regulated public displays of mocking jokes and laughter in everyday life. These laws, however, were rendered inoperative only on special occasions, such as during the festivals dedicated to Dionysus and Demeter. At these festivals, which were outside the space of everyday political life, the critical power of communal laughter was exercised at the comedies. Here, communal laughter was able to challenge social values and political powers through the use of satire. After establishing the Greek identification of the destructive capacity of laughter, I will turn to Marx's early writings on the Prussian censorship. Marx argues that the most pernicious kinds of censorships are not the laws that restrict what we are allowed to say, but the laws that appeal to a community's mores by reinforcing the specific emotions that are considered appropriate for measured speech. Marx pays particular attention to the restriction of an attitude of mocking humor and laughter. Finally, after drawing on certain parallels between Athenian censorship of ancient laughter and the 1842 Prussian censorship of German affect, I'll look to Marx's attention to Greek comedy. Marx identifies comedy in his own time not as occurring in a festive space that is an exception to the law, but instead as emerging in the creative destruction of the law itself. Following Marx, I argue that the revolutionary spirit of comedy is required to laugh down laws and norms that preserve themselves by bidding an attitude of modesty and seriousness. This first section is called Ancient Law on Laughter. At first, it may seem ironic that the Spartans, who prided themselves on their severity, placed laughter at the center of their ideology and practice. According to Plutarch, the Spartans erected monuments that represented the fundamental forces that shape human experience. Of these deities, death, fear, and laughter are the only ones mentioned by name, and appear to be upheld above the rest. While Aristotle famously claims that laughter is an activity proper to human beings, Greek literature more commonly characterizes laughter as a natural and divine force, which at times is directed against humanity. In Homer's hymns, for example, Gaia makes a joke by creating a narcissus, an irresistible flower. Persephone, an innocent human child, falls victim to the joke. When she plucks the flowers, she is damned to the underworld, and all of nature shakes with laughter. The members of the Spartan religious cult carried tiny figurines of the deity Galos, as a constant reminder of this destructive primordial force. However, their relationship to the god of laughter was not one of submission. Instead, the Spartans sought to harness the power of laughter by institutionalizing it within their education systems. In one coming-of-age test, a clan of teenage girls were directed to single out a boy of the same age, who would be ridiculed in front of an older male audience. The boy's task was to take the jokes, while the old men laughed heartily at his expense. For another edifying use of laughter, a Spartan boy and a slave boy were brought side by side in front of an audience. Each was brutally beaten. The audience anticipated that the Spartan boy would take his beating stoically, and when the untrained boy would cry, the crowd would erupt in laughter. The institutionalization of communal laughter for the Spartans was used to enforce law and class distinction and to train each member of the community to face his own death and the death of his enemy without fear. While the Spartans recognized communal laughter as a power required to increase the glory of the state, the Athenians identified such laughter as a threat to democracy. The Athenians also saw laughter as entwined with the forces of fear and death, but in acknowledging its violent tendencies, approached laughter with much more caution than the Spartans. Aristotle writes in his Rhetoric that although an important part of maturation involves learning how to take a joke, as the Spartans also taught, one must also learn how to make a joke with moderation. Athenian culture proudly defended the freedom of speech. However, certain tones or emotional colors of speech were identified as dangerous and prohibited by laws dating back to Solon. So although Athenian law granted freedom of the content of speech, it nevertheless concerned itself with the spirit in which speech was delivered. These laws on affect or style specifically targeted public speech that took on a mocking tone, or could induce katagelos. This sort of laughter that Hobbes later noted fills one with glory through the experience of the defeat of one's opponent. Athenian law specifically restricted the ridicule and mocking laughter of one's fellow citizen in public places, such as the temples, the courts, official buildings, the games, and the agora. The concern against the immodesty of laughter was so great that laws against ridicule extended to the dead, who were protected from the laughter of the living. These laws, which were presented as cultivating a democratic environment for free speech, directed each citizen to treat laughter with seriousness, applying it to the appropriate context and always with a degree of modesty. The fear of being publicly mocked by one's enemy is evidenced in the anxiety expressed by the heroes of Greek drama. We see that even kings and queens cower at the idea of being ridiculed by their foes. In Sophocles' Antigone, for example, Creon warns his son that he would disgrace himself and his lineage by marrying a woman who laughed at the law of the king. In Euripides' Electra, Clytemnestra rarely leaves her house for fear of being mocked by the people. And in the Bacchae, Pentheus begs Dionysus not to make a joke out of him in front of the women who the king himself has recently ridiculed with laughter. It often appears that for the Greeks, to be laughed at by one's enemies is directly connected to the fear of physical violence and death. In one historical example, Aeschines goes as far as to claim at his trial that the torture of mocking laughter is worse than the penalty of death. He writes, "It is not death that is terrible, but the outrageous treatment, the hubris at the point of death. Is it not pitiful to have to see an enemy scoffing in one's face, to hear his insults in one's ears? While we don't know exactly how well these laws against affect were enforced in Athens, the deep cultural apprehensive, not only about being laughed at, but also about participating in mocking laughter, is clear. Euripides captures this sensibility in Electra, who struggles with the strong urge to mock the corpse of Agathos. Although she is overjoyed, by the death of her oppressor, Electra hesitates to give in to the chorus's invitation to dance over the corpse of her brother, or to dance over his corpse, and her brother's invitation to victoriously mock the severed head of her enemy. Electra wavers for a moment before yielding to her desire to laugh, and then hurls Agathos' head at his body. Be damned, I regret that you cannot know how you have paid at last a just price. Orestes claims that the only way to silence their enemies' laughter is to kill their mother, but to trick their mother, they must hide their own laughter, caused by the exhilaration of their stepfather's murder. Electra, fueled with the thrill of having the last laugh, carries out her mother's murder. While there's no conclusive evidence that theater was officially exempt from the censorship laws regarding ridicule, there are plenty of counts in ancient drama of mocking laughter directed at both the living and the dead. The audience of both tragedy and comedy could indulge in the laughter of a fictive character who could not be punished for behavior that would be illegal in real life. While both tragedy and comedy experiment with illicit laughter, the role of the audience in tragedy, like that of the chorus, is to cast judgment on the tragic hero, who will ultimately be ruined by the hubris of her own laughter. In comedy, however, when the protagonist mocks worn-out customs, corrupt political leaders, or contradictory laws, including those regarding censorship, the audience openly shares in the laughter. The shift between tragedy, the older of the two dramatic forms, and comedy can be identified in the transformed role of the audience. In tragedy, the comic hero does not know how she feels about her action until she is made to feel shame or regret afterwards by the chorus. In comedy, the audience, like the comic actor, is free to express whatever affect strikes her most deeply. While ritualistic laughter was utilized to enforce the Spartan way of life, Dionysian laughter, in the context of the comedies, allowed for Athenian citizens to break character by violating their usual daily reverence towards Athenian law and custom. So the second section, called Marx on Seriousness and Modesty. The 1842 Prussian censorship mirrors Athenian law in two ways. First, it declared it unlawful to censor a serious and modest investigation of the truth. Second, while proclaiming to protect free speech, it discouraged certain tones or affects that it marked as characteristic of destructive tendencies of critical speech. Marx's early writings on the censorship, written in the form of fiery pamphlets intended for a wide audience, received less attention than his later works, which are seen as representing his mature political philosophy. However, it is in these writings that Marx takes up the early modern theme of political affect, and argues that the restrictions on affects, such as humor and laughter, deaden a community's sense of political agency, making critical thought feeble. The 1842 censorship, entitled Laws on the Freedom of the Press, was an amendment to the censorship laws established in 1819. The original censorship named a series of subjects that could not be criticized by the press. The new amendment claimed to release the public from these temporary strictures. It claimed to free the press from improper restrictions and, quote, any undue constraints on the activities of writers. It went on to address individual articles of the 1819 law, lifting the former limitations on the content of critique. However, like Athenian law on free speech, the right to freedom of expression only applied to the speech's content. A censorship was not itself banned by the 1842 amendment, but merely shifted into the register of affect. That is, it redirected the censorship to focus on the spirit in which such critiques were delivered, and took on the ambiguous task of monitoring certain extreme or disruptive tendencies of different kinds of speech. For example, the amendment states that law can no longer prevent media from conducting a, quote, frank discussion of international affairs of Prussian state. However, such discussions must take caution to present the state in a favorable light to countries that threaten the security of the state. In another instance, the amendment states that law can no longer silence critiques of religion. However, a serious critique of Christianity must avoid sounding too frivolous or too hostile. Conversely, a religious body can no longer be prevented from voicing disapproval of the state, but any opposition must not adopt a tone that is too fanatic. While the 1819 law directly dictated which subjects of public speech are legitimate and illegitimate, the 1842 amendment made an appeal for objective and respectable public discourse. Affects and tones such as frivolity or hostility were identified as a threat to the need for frank and decent public speech. At first glance, the 1842 amendment, which both lifts the former strictures on the subject matter of speech and claims to create a civil environment for public debate, seems laudable. Who can object for the call for philosophical discourse to be open and polite to all perspectives, or the call for religious discourse to be tolerant and measured, the call for the media to be frank and objective? Yet, as Marx sees it, laws or values regarding speech that have the appearance of fostering an atmosphere conducive to serious critical inquiry are in fact more pernicious than laws that directly inhibit what we may say or do. Without the freedom of affect, our commentary on the world becomes complacent. The Prussian censorship tells us, Marx writes, you may write freely, but at the same time, every word must curtsy to liberal censorship, which allows you to express your equally serious and modest opinions. Indeed, do not lose your feeling of reverence. Marx argues that both the affects of seriousness and modesty place an individual at a distance from whatever she might seek to understand. And in the end, Marx seems to think that this regulation of affect is barely tenable. Serious and modesty, Marx writes, what fluctuating and relative concepts? Where does serious cease and jocularity begin? Where does modesty seek and immodesty begin? If you want to be consistent, forbid also a too serious and too modest investigation of the truth. For too great seriousness is the most ludicrous thing of all, and too great modesty is the bitterest irony. Marx insists that when serious and modesty are given as the proper attitude for one seeking to understand truth, a third affect is suppressed, humor. Like his fellow young Hegelians, Marx identifies humor as a political affect, specifically because it challenges an attitude of reverence. Insisting that one approach laws and norms with reverence prohibits one from approaching them at all. Furthermore, the greatest threat to critique, in Marx's view, is boredom. A serious and modest investigation which lacks the ability to incite laughter at the absurdity of the object of critique also lacks the ability to excite not only the audience, but the author herself. I am humorous, Marx declares, but the law bids me to write seriously. I am audacious, but the law commands that my style be modest. Gray, all gray is the sole and rightful color of freedom. If we are too serious in our critical inquiry, we grow bored with ourselves and forget the real power of critique to destroy the contradictions it observes. Critique gains power when we have the audacity to laugh in the face of that which we once upheld with reverence. As Marx puts it, I treat the ludicrous seriously when I treat it ludicrously. This is the final section called Critique as Comedy. Marx's critique on the censorship of humor provides a context for his attention to the spirit of Greek comedy in his writings that follow, writings such as the contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of the right, published 1 year later, and the 18th Brumaire, published 10 years later. Marx sees humor as the rising spirit of a society that can no longer defend the contradictions of its values. Communal laughter is necessary to challenge laws or norms that have been reinforced by appealing to our sense of appropriateness or seriousness. He anticipates the emergence of comedy in his own time, not as a genre belonging to the space of the festival, but as a central movement of a community to destroy a former historical stage. In a contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of the right, which he sees as possible through the transition from a historical stage of tragedy, which occurs at the end of an old epoch to one of comedy which concludes an epoch. As he writes, history is thorough and passes through many phases when it conveys an old form to the grave. The final phase is its comedy. The Greek gods, already mortally wounded tragically, had to die once more, comically. Why does history proceed this way? So that mankind will separate itself happily from its past. The process of bringing an exhausted social or political order to the grave, to make space for the life of new societal practice and belief, is represented in ancient drama by the death of the gods. The gods, each of which embodies a distinct aspect of Hellenistic culture, undergo death twice on the stage, once in tragedy and once again in comedy. The gods of tragedy undergo a slow, natural death, representing an internal erosion of an established way of life. At the end of tragedy, the old gods fade with the fading confidence of people who come to feel the inherent contradictions of their conventions, even without fully recognizing the source of their conflicts. It is here that they become ripe for the comedic spirit of social critique. As Marx frames it in the 18th Brumaire, a tragic stage of history corresponds with the first phase of critique. This is the critical stage of refutation, which only offers partial or superficial liberation from a deeply ingrained order. At the first stage of critique, the tradition of the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. For even in the dissolved faith of members of the community, the old gods are sustained by the structure of habit, ritual, and law. The dead must not be laughed at least not out loud. Yet silent laughter belongs to the ironist, who sees the contradiction of those who treat that which alienates them from their own affect with seriousness. Yet the humorous insight of the ironist deceives him. He does not escape the order that he critiques. For even when he feels that his ironic perspective offers him critical distance from the reverent members of his community, the ironist remains subject to the same strange social and political orders that structure the tragic stage. As Maudin Delare has argued, when laughter provides a superficial sense of freedom, allowing a subject to feel separate from that which he rightly experiences as absurd, ideology has its strongest hold on an individual. For this reason, the old gods, which have already become something of a farce to the critical spectator of tragedy, must undergo a second and final death in comedy. A death that is quite different from the ultimately tragic humor of the ironist. The second and final phase of critique, corresponding with historical comedy, is the destruction by public laughter. As Marx puts it, in real comedy, critique is not a scalpel but a weapon. Its object is its enemy, which it wishes not to refute but to destroy, for the spirit of these conditions, which aims to destroy, is already refuted. Indignation is its essential pathos, denunciation its principal task. Critique at the end of a historical stage of tragedy is expressed through the remorseful irony when a community comes to feel the fundamental contradictions of the way of life it once revered. At the historical stage of comedy, critique is expressed through indignant laughter. Through indignation, a community takes action, not to mock, but to destroy that which it formerly held as sacred. Here, society takes deliberate action to destroy the political and social structures that sustain the comatose gods as living dead. As we explored in the beginning of this paper, the Spartan state institutionalized the destructive power of humor to reinforce class structure in Spartan law. The Athenians, alternatively, saw mocking laughter as a potential threat to the order of the polis, and thus enforced moderation in everyday life. When Marx draws on the ancient coupling of laughter and violence, however, it is to direct the critical power of humor against an oppressive state. Marx quotes David Hume, who claims an age in which we may feel what we wish and say what we feel is a rare fortune. So in conclusion, I have argued that the freedom of affect is necessary for speech to result in liberating action.
Questions for Rachel? All right, I will start. thought it was interesting that you were talking about the Spartans and their approach to comedy. Well, there was a lot of interesting things about it, but I was curious if, and also I thought it was interesting that you quoted Aristotle's comment on it, who was famously not Athenian, which is interesting. But I was curious if in your research, and I don't know if this is necessarily something that you find interesting, but the number of references in Athenian comedy or tragedy to Spartan comedy specifically. Are there places where famous Athenians make reference to Spartans? Because I know it works. I mean, it works the other way. For instance, I think, is it Xenocrates who is Spartan, and he actually is one of the few sources other than Plato who can tell us about the life of Socrates. So I know that, I mean, maybe it's just down to antiquity and what's been preserved or whatever, but are there explicit references amongst the Athenians, specifically the comics, towards Spartan comedy or these practices?
I actually am not sure, especially within the dramas, if there's references. I'm sure. I think Aristophanes must poke fun at the Spartans. But I do know that, I mean, at least I think that some of the laws were sort of in response to sort of the Spartan severity and sort of the violence, that how they used it in a really violent way. Not just the Spartans, but probably other communities too. Yeah, but I'm not sure about specific references in dramas, but I definitely should look at that.
Yeah, because I guess what was curious is just like maybe Aristophanes or others, if they particularly like spoof these practices and make it explicit that they're Spartan practices, or if they just sort of adopt it to be able to make the point, you know, as the Athenians often do, right? They borrow a lot of things to make their points. But yeah, it'd be interesting if there are actually nods given to specific Spartan comics. Sorry, that was kind of a comment slash question, probably wasn't helpful for
good thing for me to look at. I do think that they saw it as what made them different from other Greek communities, and it's all part of like having a democratic environment and free speech. So that this was a safe place for people to come and speak.
Thank you.
I was wondering, so part of what you're basically talking about is the critical function of laughter. And I was thinking about the first commissar of the Enlightenment in Soviet times was Anatoly Lunacharsky, and he wrote a couple of essays on humor and the revolutionary function of laughter. But the thing is he's still, all of the examples that he gives of sort of this comic revolution is still always in reference to what has been revoluted or whatever from. So I guess I've always wondered what becomes of comedy once the revolution has been accomplished. So on the assumption that the stage has been passed and now we've accomplished sort of a true communistic structure. So then what happens to comedy?
Well, I liked the point that you made, is that the idea of the comic is sort of this spirit which sort of frees the other affects. It's not that we have to walk around with like a attitude of irreverence or scoffing or this sort of destructive attitude all the time, but it's just the freedom to feel, to respond to absurdity when we experience it, or to respond to contradiction when we feel it. I guess allows for the freedom of all the other affects too. I think for Marx, he saw seriousness as sort of like as opposed to the spirit of laughter as the thing that sort of represses all the other affects. So, I mean, maybe there's not a constant comedic action of just this period of destruction, but just the comic spirit would always allow us to sort of remain critical in a way that's effective, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I know that wasn't quite what you were talking about, but it's just something that I was curious.
Yeah, thanks for that. Sorry.
Go first.
All right. I was sort of wondering if you had or were developing any thoughts to bring some of this into like a current context. Specifically, I was really interested in what you were talking about with reverence and reification, how like that over seriousness like leads to the suppression, you know, of jocularity and humor. How does that speak to something like what we have today? For instance, you know, politicians aren't supposed to be funny. You know, if Obama does Between Two Ferns, then he's ridiculed, and, you know, Lincoln would never do that, even though Lincoln told numerous fart jokes that I'm aware of. You know, so, but at the same time, despite all their seriousness, nothing politicians say ever has any reverence. They're always saying one thing and then backing away from it and then apologizing it, and it's always, oh, well, that's not what I said, or you misunderstood me, or so on and so forth. Do you have any, or are you developing any insights on some of what you're talking about here, which I think is very good and interesting, on kind of current political context, where you have these tensions between reverence and jocularity and the overall kind of seriousness?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to, especially my last chapter of this project. I'd like to turn to more contemporary context. I'm not exactly sure what I'll do for that, but I mean, the way I see the 18th Brumaire, Marx identifies like two kinds of comedy. The one's like the farcical kind that's not the real comedy. It ultimately is tragic. And this is like the kind of the ironic laughter that you laugh without changing anything. And actually this laughter, if it's not accompanied by action or change, it actually reinforces and preserves the thing that you're laughing at. So Obama being interviewed in the Two Ferns by Zach, he's on the inside of the joke making jokes about drones, and it seems, we can laugh at it, those of us who are critical at drones, because it feels like he's like self-conscious about it. He's like making a self-critique. But at the same time, because he's on the inside of the joke, he appears to be very self-critical, but it's not going to actually change anything. So he's able to laugh at himself. In a way, this is a kind of conservative comedy. The whole thing, I mean, that whole thing, it seems like very progressive, but it ends up being a very conservative thing that ends up sort of making it seem like, oh, we have this open critique of it, even Obama himself is a part of it, but in a way it just justifies it in the end. So that's one thing I'm interested in, how comedy, and I see this with like a lot of comedy on TV, like something like 30 Rock, or I don't know, some things that they sort of make fun of gender dynamics or make fun of these different things, but in a way that doesn't really suggest that we should change anything. So that's one thing I'm kind of identifying as these like farcical masquerades that aren't real comedy. I'm also, one thing I've just begun to think about is one reason that Marx thinks that these censorships on affects are so pernicious is that it's sort of regulating how we feel. It's not something you can actually explicitly punish somebody for how they feel, but it makes everybody suspicious. So I'm kind of interested in censorship and just like the NSA and how people start to feel like even their inner disposition, how they feel is sort of under watch.
Yeah, I think it was a terrific paper, very thought-provoking. Now with the Q&A, I'd like to ask you a lot of questions. I'll stay with one though, and I think that in scare quotes, psychoanalytically speaking, we're on entirely different tracks. You're on the Marx track, the prosaic track, how these views of humor work out in the polity, you know, in Athens and Greece and so on. And for me, the big deal in especially ancient Greece is the Dionysian festivals. The tragedies, which are free of reference to real human beings, and the comedies, which, with the exception of frogs, you know, have nothing but real human beings. And with respect to what was said about your dissertation, Hegel said, Aristophanes is as important as Socrates and Sophocles and so on, and if it weren't historically authenticated, we could never have conceived of how much freedom there was. And this is on the parallel track to your suspicion of laughter and so on. And I'm not sure there's a question there, but I would say that, just to put it in a form of a challenge, it's these festivals that'll tell you the truth about what's going on in Greek culture, rather than what they're doing with the shopkeepers and what they're doing in the rhetorical environment and so on.
No, I think I agree with you, actually, if that didn't come across. I think the festivals are where the sort of the seat of critique gives birth to the seat of critique. And it allows a space where one can feel what they want to about and actually feel the contradictions of the law, something that they feel in everyday life, but they're not allowed to laugh at it, or so that this gives them the space to feel how they want to about these contradictions. So I like Marx' moves because he wants the space of the festival, and maybe he sees this as happening in Greek culture. I mean, that's why he says the gods do die twice, and the result of this is a historical comedy. So the festivals are not just an exception to the law one day of the year, or a few days of the year, but the festival takes over society and allows us to enter a new epoch. So I'm kind of interested from when art leaves the stage and the audience becomes part of this stage, and and then where the festival leaves I guess where comedy leaves the festival, and society becomes this sort of comedy as it destroys its old way of life.
Right. And as if it isn't always a comedy.
Yeah, so then this is just one move in my dissertation. Next I do go to Hegel, and Hegel sees this as still sort of this sort of happy separation from the past as still kind of a superficial freedom. The Greek sort of laughter, this happy laughter at the past. He thinks there's an element of mourning in the separation from the past. So it is a comic. That's why I write on a comic anguish in the end. So.
Ms. Aumiller, we will argue again later.
Yes. Okay. Wonderful. One more.
Last question, bro.
Okay. Thank you again for a wonderful talk. My question is similar to Donovan's, I think, but maybe coming at it from a slightly different angle. If it seems like one could tell a story of the history of laughter that, rather than focusing on its critical power, maybe focuses on a kind of self-satisfied laughter that sort of reaffirms, my laughter sort of affirming my way of being, and maybe the Obama and Between Two Ferns fits into this story in a way, but not so much as ironic laughter, but laughter at something else of which I am other. And I'm wondering how that story, if such a history could be told, would fit into your more critical conception.
I mean, do you think you said self-affirming laughter that, because there's kind of two self-affirming laughters. One that's like a laughter directed at the thing you defeat, where you get self-affirmation.
I'm thinking self-satisfied laughter, which might be even worse, right? Like laughter that sort of reaffirms my betterness than something else. The philosophers all get together and laugh at the hoi polloi or something like that. That kind of laughter.
Yeah, so I agree with this, and I guess this is kind of my critique of Marx in the end. That would be like my next step is you can like laugh at the past and laugh at our old way of life, and like in this laughter become the creators, the comic creators and destroyers of our culture or something like that, of our old way of life. And what he says, it's a happy separation with the past. So I do kind of see this, if you want to call it smugness or something, or self-satisfaction, that maybe is not a thorough, what should I say? I don't know if it's a way to sort of gain peace with the past or something like that. Can we just like laugh at the past? But I think there's in laughing at destroying our old way of life, we have to see ourselves in that destruction. There's sort of a self-destruction in destroying our old way of life. These things that we revered them and we took them seriously and we defined ourselves through these beliefs for so long, even if they did place us at contradiction with ourselves, when we destroy them, I think there has to be an element of grief like in that laughter. Seeing yourself in the thing that you're laughing at and the thing you're destroying at, kind of maybe in the final instance, this moment where you see yourself in the thing you destroy. I think that would be a way of really laughter coming to its fulfillment in a way that allows you to sort of heal the relationship between the present and the past that we have to destroy in order to go forward. Yes.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.